Hello everyone, I'm TectonicImprov, and I just figured I'd ask, did you play this? Did you play this? The series of videos where I review/discuss games from my childhood I find little discussion of online. Now that the Pokemon stuff is over, for now, I figured it was time for the bi-yearly installment of the series. Today's game will probably be the most well-known in the series, as it's an IP that was loved by most people who owned a Nintendo 64 growing up. I'll spare you all the backstory of Rareware and their accolades, as I'm sure you're well aware of it by now, but I do want to give my perspective as a kid growing up in the GameCube era, during the interim period when Rare was being acquired by Microsoft. I don't remember where or when I heard Rare got bought out, but when I was told about it, I found it hard to believe. I mean, they had just released Star Fox Adventures. What do you mean they work for Microsoft now? It didn't help that I hardly had a grasp on business deals and IP ownership. Banjo-Kazooie felt as much a part of Nintendo as Mario or Samus did to me. To have to come to terms with the fact that he'd never be on a Nintendo system again was a hard pill to swallow. Except, he did return to a Nintendo system. Just not the one you'd expect. So remember all that confusion I had earlier about IP ownership? Well, double that confusion when I found out that they made a Banjo-Kazooie for the Gameboy Advance after Rare was acquired by Microsoft. Nowadays, it makes sense to me. Microsoft didn't have a portable console, so they must have figured it wouldn't be competition if they allowed a Banjo game on a portable competitor. Grunty's Revenge had been in development since the Game Boy Color, so to have all that development time go to waste probably wasn't something they wanted to happen. They didn't publish the game, however. THQ picked up the slack in that regard, and let me say how weird it is to see their logo on a Banjo-Kazooie game. To get started, let me summarize the story. You all should sit down for this one. Actually, hang on, I should probably sit down for this one too. Okay, so Grunty's Revenge actually takes place in between Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie. It's an interquel. Grunty is still stuck under the boulder that slammed our ass back in the first game, and both Klungo, that green guy, and Grunty come up with a plan to free her. Klungo builds a robot body for Grunty to possess, and then the two proceed to kidnap Kazooie, time-traveling to the past to make it so Banjo and her never meet, wiping Grunty's defeat in the first game from history. Banjo is then sent back in time by Mumbo, the skull-masked shaman guy right there, to follow Grunty. There he has to rescue Kazooie, collect Jiggies from separate worlds, and stop Grunty from completing this nefarious task. Of course, Banjo and Kazooie both succeed and send Grunty back to the rock she was stuck inside, tying into the events of Banjo-Tooie. The story of this game is weird. Sure, there was fantastical elements in the other two Banjo games up to this point, but neither went as far as to include time travel of all things. Time travel is the nuclear option, and since it's now on the table, there's a million questions I could ask about what happened in Kazooie and Tooie. Like, why not go back in time before Bottles got DEFCON 1'd by Grunty to stop him from dying? I realize that this is overanalyzing. I'm just trying to drive the point home that time travel doesn't really feel necessary. Omit the time travel aspect, and this game is basically the same. It's almost like a throwaway line. And the dialogue. Anyone who's played Banjo-Kazooie and Tooie could tell you that the games have that unique, rare sense of humor. These games, well, I won't lie, I got a chuckle every now and then, mostly from Kazooie's interactions with Bozai, but that's about it. That said, the writing wasn't terrible or anything, just not nearly up to par as the first two games. Same goes for the voices, they sound particularly shrill in this game. I was immediately put off by it, and borderline annoyed. I eventually got used to them, but that wasn't really a great first impression. And while we're on the subject of sound, I think I should talk about the soundtrack. It's decent? When I was watching the credits at the end of the game, I noticed Grant Kirkhope's name was nowhere to be seen, and my lukewarm feelings on the soundtrack began to make sense. He's credited online as a composer, but that's most likely due to the fact that his Spiral Mountain theme is used in the game. I have to imagine all of the other music was done by a guy named Jamie Hughes. Unfortunately, his contributions don't come close to matching Kirkhope's legendary tunes. Okay, so obviously they couldn't make a full 3D collectathon for the Game Boy Advance, so Grunty's Revenge decides to go for an isometric style using pre-rendered sprites. There were actually a few of these kinds of games in the GBA,
like the Spyro Season games.
I actually had the Spyro game, but let me just nip this one in the bud and say if you did play that, I'm sorry. Couple the compromised screen size of the GBA with Spyro's fast-paced movement and you get a disaster. Thankfully, Banjo manages to translate to the isometric gameplay better than Spyro did. With Banjo being a pretty slow game, it's much easier to take in the scenery at your own pace. Except at points later in the game where they want you to rush to a certain area to grab a Jiggy in time. There were a lot of these time challenges in the original game, so I'm not surprised to see them here, but I do think they highlight one of the biggest problems with Grunty's Revenge: the isometric viewpoint. I think anyone who has ever played an isometric game, or hopefully even see the footage on display here, can understand the issue. Depth perception just doesn't exist in these games. You'll think you have a jump locked down, only to realize you're actually a whole banjo away from your destination. If depth perception wasn't bad enough, sometimes it's hard to actually see the things you're collecting. Whose bright idea was it to have so many yellows in a game where the main collectible is yellow? The locations themselves also feel like retreads and uninspired. Out of the 6 worlds, we have a grassy farm, a beach, a swamp, an industrial town, and an ice world with a fire world mixed in. All of these levels, besides Cliff Farms and maybe Spiller's Harbor, have analogs in either Banjo-Kazooie or Tooie, and I'm being generous with not including those last 2 levels. It's not a deal breaker by any means, just a bit of a letdown. The power-ups in this game aren't anything new either. They're pretty much all recycled moves from the prior games, except for one. It's called the Battery Egg, and you fire it at a specific location to solve puzzles. But you won't really find yourself using the Battery Eggs, or any egg for that matter, unless you absolutely have to, because of how unruly it is to use them. To use eggs, you have to hold L, then press B to bring out Kazooie like a gun. Then once you've done that, you can fire off eggs in 8 different directions while moving. The problem with this is the amount of time it takes to actually fire off an egg from when you press L is so long. If you're using this to hurt enemies, they've probably already attacked you first. That is, assuming you're even able to hit them. The depth perception can really screw with you when trying to attack enemies. You also move pretty slow while using this ability, so it's not a good idea to just walk around with your hand at your hip. I understand that this was probably the best they could do considering the limited button space, but this isn't the only ability that suffers from being on the Game Boy Advance. The Wonder Wings have been relegated to only being activatable on special icons. Why is it like this? Couldn't they have used the select button at least? By the time I had a majority of my moves, I really felt that the GBA was holding the team back. Finally, I want to talk about the bosses. Sadly, they're pretty disappointing. Pretty much every boss fight is either Klungo and Mecha Grunty, the latter of which has the amazing fight of walking briskly towards you. Look, I'm not asking for something on par with the fights from Banjo-Tooie or anything, but you can't tell me that this was the best they could do. In fact, I know they could do better, because there are some fights that are like gallery shooters, which I thought were pretty fun. The final fight, however, was just a retread of the more typical Grunty fights. Despite that though, it was a pretty big leap in difficulty. Not that this game was hard to begin with, but it still caught me off guard. It's essentially a gauntlet, where you fight Mecha Grunty, then Klungo, and Mecha Grunty again. The first fight is really easy since it's just a more drawn out version of the other Mecha Grunty battles, and in between phases you're tasked with answering quiz questions. These are pretty easy, most of the time. Sometimes, instead of just answering questions though, you'll be tasked with completing a minigame. Minigames that can kill you while you're playing. I lucked out several times while fighting this boss and managed to only get quiz questions, but the one time I did get a minigame, I ended up dying in it and had to restart the entire fight. The real bastard in this gauntlet though is Klungo, or rather the ghosts he spawns. I didn't know this until the fight, but depending on the color of ghost, which is randomly determined in this fight by the way, a certain type of egg will defeat them. Which, that alone is fine. The problem arises when you realize that the ghosts are incredibly fast once they have you in their sights, and remember what I said about shooting eggs, it's incredibly slow. Unless you get lucky and guess correctly which ghost will appear, you're bound to take a hit, which I hardly find fair. The final fight with Mecha Grunty involves attacking the soul that pops outside of the Mecha Grunty body when it's attacked. This part is pretty easy until doppelgangers of the soul appear alongside it. The difference between the real and the fakes is pretty subtle, so you have to be careful when deciding which one to hit, because if you get it wrong, you'll just get hurt. I thankfully managed to get past this one with one hit remaining, and wow was I happy it was over. So what, is this game all bad? Well no, I wouldn't call it bad. In fact, despite all the complaints I had, I gotta say, they managed to still capture the feeling of a Banjo-Kazooie game. You still collect notes, Jinjos, Jiggies, get special moves, change into different forms via Mumbo. I have to say that I think this game is pretty impressive considering how much of a hardware downgrade the GBA is compared to the N64. It's just that there's a lot of problems that crop up, mostly because of the switch to the GBA. This feels like a Banjo game, but it feels like an incredibly truncated Banjo game. Look no further than the length. I managed to beat this game in a little over 3 hours after having not played it in about 10 years. And I think Truncated is something important to keep in mind if you're thinking of playing Grunty's Revenge. I'd personally only recommend it if you're already a Banjo fan and haven't gotten around to playing it. You'll probably get more out of it than the average person. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I'll be back soon.